Lena's life was simple, but not easy. Each day began well before dawn, a ritual of necessity to ensure her survival in the isolated mountains. The crackling of her wood stove greeted her every morning, a comforting sound as she bundled herself in layers of wool to face the bitter cold. Splitting firewood came first. It was a task that demanded both strength and precision. She had learned to swing the axe with practiced efficiency, knowing that without ample wood, the chill of the mountains could creep into her cabin, threatening her fragile existence. Her vegetable patch, modest as it was, stood as a testament to her determination to remain self-reliant. Even in the harshest winters, Lena worked tirelessly to protect it, covering the dormant plants with straw and burlap to shield them from the frost. Each day also required a trek to the stream that snaked through the forest below her cabin. The icy water was her lifeline, and though the journey was treacherous, Lena embraced it with stoic resolve. The snow underfoot was often deep, and the wind cut through her heavy coat, but the rhythmic sound of her boots crunching the frozen ground became a kind of meditative mantra. Her neighbors, once scattered throughout the village, had long since left for the conveniences of city life. Lena alone remained, her cabin the last bastion of human habitation in this remote corner of the world. While others may have viewed her life as lonely, Lena found a deep peace in the solitude. The forest, with its towering pines and the ever-present hush of snow, was her sanctuary. But that peace was shattered during one particularly brutal winter. It was mid-January, a time when the cold was at its most merciless. A blizzard had descended on the mountains, a ferocious storm that raged for 3 relentless days. The wind howled like a living creature, battering the wooden walls of her cabin and threatening to tear the shingles from the roof. Snow piled up so high against her door that she feared she might be trapped inside. Lena spent those days huddled by the fire, rationing her food and stoking the flames to keep the cold at bay. The isolation that she normally cherished now felt oppressive, the storm a reminder of how vulnerable she truly was. When the storm finally subsided, the world outside had been transformed. The landscape was a sea of white, pristine, and deadly. The snowdrifts reached up to the windows, and icicles hung like daggers from the eaves of her cabin. With great effort, Lena shoveled a narrow path to the door and stepped outside. The air was piercingly cold, each breath forming a cloud that lingered in the stillness. Her first priority was to check her traps, simple snares she had set along the forest's edge in the hope of catching a rabbit or two. Fresh meat was a rare luxury in the winter, and Lena was running low on provisions. It was during this routine task that she stumbled upon a sight that stopped her in her tracks. Near a fallen tree, half buried in snow, were 3 tiny bear cubs. Their small bodies were huddled together for warmth, their fur crusted with ice, and their breaths coming in faint, uneven puffs. Lena's heart clenched at the sight. She had seen bear cubs before, but never like this. Their mother was nowhere to be found, and the faint trail of paw prints leading away was already fading beneath the fresh snow. The implications were clear. The cubs had been abandoned. Whether the mother had perished in the storm or had been forced to leave them behind, Lena couldn't say. What she did know was that without intervention, these little ones would not survive the night. She approached cautiously, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The cubs' eyes, wide with fear, locked onto hers. They let out weak, pitiful cries, their voices barely audible over the stillness of the forest. Kneeling down, Lena extended a gloved hand. One of the cubs, the smallest of the trio, sniffed at her fingers before retreating to the safety of its siblings. "Poor little ones," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The sight of their trembling bodies and frost-bitten fur was almost too much to bear. She scanned the surrounding woods one last time, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of the mother bear. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, only the silent, snow-laden trees. Lena hesitated. Bringing wild animals into her home was a risk, and she knew it. Bears, even cubs, were not meant to be handled by humans. But as she looked at their fragile forms, she felt a surge of determination. She couldn't leave them here to die. Making up her mind, she removed her wool shawl and gently wrapped it around the cubs, bundling them together to shield them from the biting cold. Their combined weight was more than she had anticipated, and the walk back to her cabin would be arduous. As she began the journey, the cubs whimpered softly, their small bodies pressing against her chest as if seeking the warmth they had so desperately lacked. Lena whispered to them as she trudged through the snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You're safe now," she said, though uncertainty gnawed at the edges of her resolve. How would she care for them? What would she feed them? These questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on the immediate task of getting them to safety. By the time she reached her cabin, Lena was exhausted. Her legs ached and her arms trembled from the effort of carrying the cubs. She managed to push the door open with her shoulder, stumbling inside and closing it quickly to keep the warmth from escaping. Setting the cubs down near the fire, she unwrapped them from the shawl and arranged them on a thick blanket. They huddled together instinctively, their tiny bodies still shivering despite the heat emanating from the flames. Lena worked quickly, her hands moving with purpose despite her fatigue. She heated a pot of goat's milk on the stove, pouring it into a shallow bowl. Using a clean cloth, she soaked up the warm liquid and dripped it gently into the cubs' mouths. At first they were hesitant, their movements sluggish, but as the warmth spread through their bodies, they began to respond. The smallest cub, whom Lena had already named Boris in her mind, let out a soft, contented squeak that brought a smile to her face. Over the next few hours, Lena monitored the cubs closely. She created a makeshift nest for them in an old wooden crate, lining it with layers of blankets to keep them warm. As the cubs finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, their soft snores filled the cabin. Lena sank into her rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the tiny, fragile creatures she had brought into her home. The weight of the day's events settled on her, but for the first time in years, her heart felt full. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whispering through the trees and rattling the windows. But inside the cabin, the glow of the fire cast a warm, golden light over the sleeping cubs. Lena knew that the days ahead would be challenging. Caring for these wild creatures would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. But as she watched them sleep, she felt a quiet resolve take root within her. She had saved them, and in doing so, she had given herself a new purpose. The storm had passed, but a new journey was just beginning. Back at the cabin, Lena improvised a warm nest by lining an old wooden crate with blankets. It wasn't much, but it was cozy enough to shield the cubs from the biting cold that lingered in the early spring air. She placed the crate near the fireplace, ensuring they stayed warm throughout the night. The cubs, still weak and unsure of their new surroundings, huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. Lena carefully prepared a bottle of warm goat's milk, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. Kneeling beside the crate, she gently coaxed the cubs to drink. They were wary at first, their small eyes wide with uncertainty, but hunger eventually won over fear. One by one, they latched onto the bottle, their tiny mouths working with surprising vigor. Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her as she watched them feed, their fragile bodies seeming to gain strength with every sip. She named them Mishka, Boris, and Anya after her late children, a bittersweet tribute that brought tears to her eyes. Mishka, the largest of the three, was already showing signs of boldness, his curious nature evident in the way he batted at Lena's hands as she adjusted the blankets. Boris, the smallest, was timid and hesitant, clinging to his siblings for comfort. Anya, with her playful energy, seemed determined to explore her new surroundings, pawing at the edge of the crate and letting out tiny, high-pitched growls. Days turned into weeks, and under Lena's care, the cubs began to thrive. Her days revolved around their needs, feeding them every few hours, cleaning up after their messes, and ensuring they stayed warm and safe. It was exhausting work, but Lena didn't mind. For the first time in years, her cabin felt alive, filled with the sounds of soft whimpers, playful growls, and the pitter-patter of tiny paws on the wooden floor. Mishka quickly earned a reputation as the troublemaker of the group. His adventurous spirit often led him into mischief, whether it was knocking over pots and pans or climbing onto Lena's workbench to investigate her tools. Lena couldn't help but laugh at his antics, even as she scolded him gently. Boris, on the other hand, was the quietest and most affectionate. He had a habit of curling up near Lena's feet whenever she sat down to knit, his soft, rhythmic breathing a source of comfort to her. Anya was the most energetic of the trio, constantly chasing her tail or batting at Lena's knitting yarn, her playful antics bringing a much-needed sense of joy to the cabin. Word of Lena's unusual housemate soon spread to the nearest town, carried by the occasional traveler or trader who passed through the area. The reactions were mixed. Some villagers disapproved, calling her foolish or even reckless. They said she's crazy living with bears, they said, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others admired her bravery and kindness, though they doubted the cubs could ever be released back into the wild. Lena paid little attention to the gossip. Her focus remained on the cubs and their well-being. As spring approached, Lena began to think about the future. She knew the cubs couldn't stay in her cabin forever. They were growing quickly, their playful energy becoming harder to contain within the small space. Determined to prepare them for life in the wild, Lena built a large enclosure in her backyard. Using sturdy wooden posts and wire mesh, she created a safe space where the cubs could experience the outdoors without wandering too far. The enclosure was lined with soft grass, dotted with rocks and logs for climbing, and even included a shallow pool for the cubs to splash in. Lena's days were now filled with lessons. She led the cubs to the berry bushes that grew at the edge of the forest, teaching them how to forage for food. She showed them the stream where fish darted beneath the surface, demonstrating how to scoop the slippery creatures out of the water. The cubs watched her intently, their natural instincts slowly coming to the surface. Mishka, with his adventurous spirit, was the first to catch a fish, his triumphant growl earning him a congratulatory pat from Lena. Anya quickly followed suit, her playful nature turning the lesson into a game. Boris, ever cautious, took a little longer, but with Lena's encouragement, he eventually succeeded. The bond between Lena and the cubs grew stronger with each passing day. They followed her around like ducklings, their trust in her evident in the way they nuzzled against her legs or climbed onto her lap. Lena, in turn, found a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The cubs had brought new life to her quiet, solitary existence, filling her days with laughter and love. As the snow melted and the vibrant greenery of spring began to emerge, the cubs grew more confident in their surroundings. They wrestled in the grass, climbed trees with surprising agility, and splashed in the stream with unrestrained joy. Lena spent hours watching them, her heart swelling with pride and sadness. She knew the time was coming when they would have to return to the forest, their true home. The thought of saying goodbye was almost unbearable, but she reminded herself that it was the right thing to do. Lena began preparing herself for the inevitable separation. She started to distance herself slightly, encouraging the cubs to rely on their instincts rather than her care. It was a bittersweet process, one that left her cabin feeling emptier with each passing day. But Lena knew it was necessary. The forest called to the cubs louder with each sunrise, their natural instincts sharpening as they grew. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in a golden glow, Lena sat on her porch, watching the cubs play in the enclosure. They were no longer the fragile, shivering creatures she had found beneath the fallen tree. They were strong, healthy, and full of life. Tears welled in Lena's eyes as she realized just how much they had grown and how much she would miss them. "You'll do well out there," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're ready." When the cubs were nearly a year old, Lena knew the time had come. Over the months, they had transformed from fragile, shivering creatures into strong and vibrant young bears. Their once clumsy movements had grown confident, their instincts sharpening with each passing day. They no longer fit comfortably within the confines of her small cabin, their playful antics turning into powerful displays of strength that reminded Lena of their true nature. While her heart ached at the thought, Lena understood that their place was no longer with her. The forest, vast and teeming with life, was calling them home. Preparing for their departure was a bittersweet process. Lena spent days gathering supplies for the journey. She packed a satchel with dried fruits, nuts, and berries, treats the cubs had grown to love during their time together. She also carried a sturdy walking stick to help her navigate the uneven forest terrain. The cubs, sensing a change in her demeanor, followed her closely, their curious eyes watching her every move. Mishka, ever the adventurer, sniffed at the satchel, while Boris and Anya stayed close to her side, as if seeking reassurance. The morning of their departure dawned clear and bright, the sky painted in hues of soft pink and orange. Lena rose early, her movements heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. She prepared a simple breakfast for herself and the cubs, savoring the last meal they would share together. As the cubs played in the yard, wrestling and tumbling in the grass, Lena took a moment to sit on the porch, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The forest, with its towering trees and dappled sunlight, seemed both beautiful and foreboding. It had been her sanctuary for so many years, but now it felt like a rival, poised to take away the companions she had come to love so deeply. When the time came to leave, Lena led the cubs on a path that wound through the forest, her footsteps deliberate and measured. The cubs followed closely, their trust in her unwavering. They paused occasionally to sniff at the ground or chase after a fleeting shadow, but they always returned to her side. The journey was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Lena's thoughts were a whirlwind of memories. The first time she had fed them goat's milk from a bottle, the way they had played with her knitting yarn, their soft snores as they slept by the fire. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of their shared life, a life that was now coming to an end. After several hours of walking, they arrived at a clearing nestled deep within the forest. It was a place Lena had discovered long ago, during one of her solitary explorations. The clearing was bordered by tall fruit trees, their branches heavy with ripe apples and berries. A crystal-clear river cut through the center, its gentle flow creating a soothing melody that filled the air. It was a paradise, untouched and serene, and Lena knew it would be the perfect home for the cubs. She knelt down and opened the satchel, laying out the treats she had brought. The cubs approached hesitantly at first, their noses twitching as they sniffed the air. Mishka was the first to venture forward, his curiosity overcoming his caution. He pawed at an apple, rolling it across the ground before taking a tentative bite. Boris and Anya soon followed, their initial wariness giving way to delight as they discovered the feast Lena had prepared for them. Lena watched them with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "This is your home now," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You'll be safe here. There's plenty of food and the river will keep you strong." She paused, her throat tightening. "Be brave, my darlings. Be happy." One by one, the cubs approached her. Mishka, bold and affectionate, nuzzled against her hand, his warm breath brushing her fingers. Anya, ever playful, pawed at the hem of her skirt, letting out a soft, questioning growl. Boris, the smallest and most timid, pressed his head against her chest, his quiet presence speaking volumes. Lena held each of them close, her tears falling freely now, her whispered words of love and encouragement blending with the sounds of the forest. When the cubs finally turned to leave, it felt as though a part of Lena was being torn away. They moved slowly at first, their heads turning back to look at her, as if seeking one last reassurance. She raised a hand in farewell, her lips forming a tremulous smile. "Go on," she urged, her voice barely audible. "You're ready." As they disappeared into the trees, the silence that followed was deafening. Lena stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the place where they had vanished. The forest, so alive with movement and sound just moments ago, now felt achingly empty. Finally, she turned and began the long walk back to her cabin, her steps heavy with the weight of her grief. The days that followed were some of the loneliest Lena had ever known. The cabin, once filled with the lively energy of the cubs, now felt oppressively quiet. She went about her daily tasks with a sense of detachment, her hands moving on autopilot as her mind replayed memories of their time together. The small paw prints that had once dotted the snowy yard had faded, replaced by the unbroken expanse of wilderness. But amidst the aching solitude, there was also a quiet pride. Lena knew she had done what was best for the cubs, giving them the chance to live as nature had intended. She found solace in the thought that they were out there, thriving in the forest, their bond with her a distant but unbreakable memory. Lena often sat on her porch, gazing out at the forest with a mix of hope and longing. She imagined Mishka climbing trees, his adventurous spirit undimmed. She pictured Anya splashing in the river, her playful energy bringing joy to the wilderness. And she thought of Boris, her gentle soul, finding his place in the world. These images, though bittersweet, brought a measure of comfort to her heart. Over time, Lena's grief began to soften, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. The cubs had come into her life when she needed them most, filling her days with love and purpose. Their departure, though painful, was a testament to the strength of the bond they had shared. Lena knew that she would carry their memory with her always, a source of light in even the darkest moments. And so, as the seasons changed and the forest bloomed anew, Lena continued to live her simple, solitary life. The cubs were gone, but their presence lingered in the rustle of leaves, the murmur of the river, and the quiet strength of the woman who had loved them so deeply. The climax, an unbelievable act of gratitude. Months passed, and Lena resumed her solitary life. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a commotion outside. Grabbing her lantern, she stepped onto her porch and froze. There in the moonlight stood Mishka, Boris, and Anya, now fully grown. But they weren't alone. Behind them was a pile of freshly caught fish, wild berries, and even a honeycomb, a feast they had clearly brought for her. Tears streamed down Lena's face as the bears approached. They stayed for hours, sitting peacefully by the fire as if visiting an old friend. It was as if they had come back to say thank you, to show that they had not forgotten her kindness. Over the years, the bears continued to visit Lena, always bringing gifts from the forest. They protected her, too, chasing away wolves that ventured too close to her cabin. Lena's once lonely life became filled with purpose and joy, her bond with the bears a testament to the power of kindness. The visits became a ritual, marking the seasons with a special connection that defied logic and explanation. The bond between Lena and the bears became legendary in the region. Travelers and villagers often came to hear her story, inspired by the extraordinary relationship she shared with these wild creatures. Lena, however, always downplayed her role, insisting that it was the bears who had enriched her life. Lena's story spread far and wide, inspiring countless people to respect and cherish the natural world. She lived to a ripe old age, always surrounded by the love of her unusual family. When she passed, the bears visited her cabin one final time, sitting vigil outside as if mourning the loss of their beloved friend. Lena's life may have been simple, but her compassion left a legacy that will never be forgotten. Her story reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that change the world, sometimes in the most surprising ways. Lena's cabin remains untouched, a testament to her life and the bond she shared with the wild. Locals say the bears still visit, as if guarding the place that once sheltered them. It's a story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable connection between humanity and nature, proving that kindness can bridge even the widest of divides. The beginning. A harsh winter and a heartwarming discovery. Lena's life was simple, but not easy. Each day began before dawn, splitting firewood to keep her cabin warm against the relentless chill that seeped through the wooden walls. Her small vegetable patch, though modest, required daily attention, even in the bitter cold, as she covered it with burlap sacks and snow to shield it from frost. Collecting water from the nearby stream was an unforgiving chore, especially as icy winds bit at her face, numbing her fingers despite her thick gloves. Life in this remote village was a test of endurance, and Lena had grown accustomed to its challenges. Her nearest neighbors had long since moved to the city, leaving her the sole inhabitant of this secluded settlement. Yet despite the isolation, Lena found peace in the quiet rhythm of her days. The snow-covered landscape, though harsh, held a beauty that few could appreciate. But this winter was unlike any she had faced before. It was mid-January, and for 3 days a fierce blizzard had roared through the mountains, burying the village under a suffocating blanket of snow. The howling winds rattled the windows and forced Lena to stay indoors, surviving on her stored provisions of dried meats, root vegetables, and jars of preserved fruit. When the storm finally subsided, the world outside was transformed into a pristine, yet treacherous, expanse of white. Snow drifts towered as high as the roof of her cabin, and she had to use her shovel to carve a path to her front door, a task that left her breathless and weary. Her first priority, as always, was to check her traps. These simple devices, scattered along the forest's edge, were her lifeline during the harshest months. They provided her with the occasional rabbit or squirrel, supplementing her otherwise monotonous diet. Wrapping herself tightly in her thick wool coat and scarf, Lena ventured out, the snow crunching beneath her heavy boots. The air was eerily still, the forest hushed as if holding its breath after the storm. It was on this routine trek that she stumbled upon the scene that would change her life. Near a fallen tree, partially buried in snow, were three tiny bear cubs. They were huddled together, their small bodies trembling violently, their fur matted with ice. Lena froze, her heart immediately breaking at the sight. She had seen bear cubs before, but never under such dire circumstances. Their mother was nowhere to be seen, and the faint trail of paw prints leading away was already disappearing under the fresh snowfall. Lena approached cautiously, her breath visible in the cold air. The cubs' eyes widened as they saw her, and they let out pitiful cries, their voices weak from exhaustion. Kneeling in the snow, Lena's gloved hand reached out, and one of the cubs, the smallest, sniffed her hesitantly. "Poor little ones," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with worry. She scanned the area again, hoping to catch sight of the mother bear, but there was no sign of her. The realization hit Lena like a blow. These cubs had been abandoned, whether by choice or tragedy. Without intervention, they wouldn't survive the night. Lena's mind raced. She knew the risks of interfering with wild animals. Bears, even cubs, were not meant to be handled by humans. Yet as she looked into their pleading eyes, she knew she couldn't leave them there to perish. "What choice do I have?" she whispered to herself, her breath forming a cloud around her face. Making up her mind, she unwrapped her woolen shawl, draping it over the cubs to shield them from the biting wind. One by one, she lifted their fragile bodies, tucking them into the folds of the shawl and securing them against her chest. Their combined weight was heavier than she expected, and the journey back to her cabin would be arduous. The walk back was slow and grueling. The snow was deep, and each step required effort, her boots sinking into the drifts with every stride. The cubs whimpered softly, their tiny bodies pressing against hers as if seeking the warmth they had so desperately lacked. Lena's heart ached with each sound, and she whispered reassurances as she trudged forward. "You're safe now," she said, though uncertainty weighed heavily on her mind. How would she care for them? What would she feed them? These questions loomed, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. By the time Lena reached her cabin, her legs felt like lead, and her breath came in labored puffs. She managed to open the door with her free hand, stumbling inside and closing it quickly to keep the warmth from escaping. Carefully, she placed the cubs on a thick blanket by the fire, unwrapping them from her shawl. They huddled together instinctively, their tiny bodies still shivering despite the heat emanating from the flames. Lena quickly set to work, her mind racing with the urgency of the situation. She heated some goat's milk on the stove, pouring it into a bowl and soaking a clean cloth in the warm liquid. Using the cloth, she gently dripped milk into each cub's mouth, coaxing them to drink. At first they were hesitant, their movements sluggish, but as the warmth spread through their bodies, they began to respond. The smallest cub, whom Lena had already dubbed Boris in her mind, let out a soft squeak of contentment that brought a smile to her face. Over the next few hours, Lena monitored the cubs closely, ensuring they stayed warm and hydrated. She created a makeshift nest for them in an old wooden crate, lining it with blankets and placing it near the fire. Exhausted from the ordeal, she sank into her rocking chair, watching as the cubs finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. Their soft snores filled the cabin, a sound that was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. As Lena sat there, her thoughts turned to the days ahead. Caring for the cubs would not be easy. They were wild animals, and their needs would grow as they did. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were alive, and she had given them a chance they wouldn't have had without her intervention. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the windows and carrying with it the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, by the warm glow of the fire, a new chapter was beginning. Lena's simple life had just become a great deal more complicated, but as she looked at the tiny sleeping forms of Mishka, Boris, and Anya, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't change a thing.